Thousands of automated debt letters are being generated by a new federal government computer system that cross-checks all payments with tax office records.
We will find you, we will track you down, and you will have to repay those debts, and you may end up in prison.
The answer to Julian's question is that when a notice is issued and it appears to the person to whom the notice is issued that a mistake has been made, they can contact Centrelink and sort out the problem.
Oh, they can wait on the phone for a
while. Hello, my name is Jan Wisniewski and this is The Strife, a podcast to discuss issues in Australia with the long term in mind. Today, we're talking robo-debt, a former scandal in Australia which once sparked outrage but now in which interest has waned. Why talk about it now? Well, because freelance journalist Gillian Terzis wrote an excellent piece for Logic magazine entitled Austerity is an Algorithm, in which, by discussing the scandal, she is able to shed light on the connection between the provision of social services, the neutrality of technology, and the ideologies connected to Australia's welfare state. Let's have a listen to my chat with her right now. Okay, so before we get into the questions, I'll give a quick rundown of today's topic, and that is the robo-debt scandal which hit headlines last summer in Australia. Basically, to refresh everyone's memories, a whole bunch of people received letters from Centrelink because the government's automated debt recovery system, or robo-debt, had identified discrepancies in what welfare recipients told Centrelink compared to their tax records. A lot of these letters were wrongly addressed, and for those people who did receive the letters, they were faced with some confusing wording or asked to find years-old pay slips or bank statements. So if these people did not respond to the letter, an algorithm was used to calculate their debt to the government. Private debt collectors were then tasked with retrieving that debt if an individual failed to pay or respond to Centrelink with updated information. And this process led to public outcry, and the government copped a lot of criticism. So we're going to get into this a bit further once I start asking you some questions. But is there anything you'd first want to add in terms of context regarding the scandal?
No, I think that's a pretty good and succinct a summary of what had happened for sure.
Okay, well, I'll get to my first question. And basically, when I was preparing for this interview, the first question that kind of popped into my head was, whose idea was this? What were the policies that led to the robo-debt scandal?
So basically, the policies that led up to the robo-debt scandal were implemented in 2011. So back then, the Australian Labor Party introduced a data matching algorithm known as OCI, or Online Compliance Intervention. And so the purpose of that policy was to compare the earnings reported by welfare recipients to the social services agency Centrelink with earnings reported to the tax office by their employers. And so the idea at the time was that this OCI, Online Compliance Intervention, would not serve a primary role in generating debt notices, but be kind of supplement work being done by Centrelink staff members. So the algorithm would detect these discrepancies. Then those discrepancies would be investigated by people from Centrelink, who would then decide whether to follow up with the welfare recipient by letter or by phone. So in some ways, you could even argue that back then the policy seemed oriented towards taking some of the load off Centrelink caseworkers, and it wasn't necessarily about generating as many debt notices as possible. But as you know, as you mentioned in your introduction, things did change in December 2016 when the coalition government announced that the system would become fully automated. So essentially what this meant was that debt notices were being automatically generated when inconsistencies were being detected, and there was no human contact with people who'd received these notices. So the onus was on the welfare recipient to contact Centrelink rather than the other way around. That's basically what happened. So what you had was all these debt notices being generated, and people felt like they had no recourse. Normally you'd have a human to talk to and you could explain your circumstances, but that didn't happen when the algorithm kind of took center stage. Oh yeah, I was just going to say, I think so far as we're reading that the system had automatically sent out over 200,000 income discrepancy letters, after detecting mismatches between Centrelink and ATO income data. And I think at the time the government had defended the policy, saying that 4 out of 5 letters had turned up debts. But another way of looking at it would be to say that that's evidence of a 20% failure rate at least.
So you read a piece recently for Logic magazine about the scandal and about the algorithm. You recall anecdotes of people targeted by the robo collectors in the piece. So I was wondering if you could share 1 or 2 of these experiences to give the listeners an idea of what individuals were dealing with.
Sure. I mean, actually, the impetus for me writing the essay was seeing a lot of my friends post about the weird kind of contact and messages they've been receiving from private debt collectors. And as I mentioned in the piece, a lot of the messages, they didn't identify. There was no clear way of finding out who they were from until you actually got on the phone, and then it was revealed that they were private debt collectors trying to extract alleged debt from Centrelink. But yeah, I had one friend who I mentioned in the piece, her name's Chloe, and she was hounded by debt collectors by text message. She initially wrote that off until she gave them a call, and it was kind of intimidating. She was saying that, it's a pretty scary thing to be told you owe $20,000 to the government. And so she, at the time, didn't even think of contesting it. She was basically coerced into going on a payment plan so she could start paying it off. And then a lot of journalistic reporting started uncovering the problems with this algorithm and this debt recovery process. So she saw all these stories that started coming out about people realizing their debt was possibly not genuine, which is to say it was probably fraudulent. So she put in a claim to contest the debt that she was told that she owed. So she did exactly what you said. She was one of those people who contacted all of her employers to get pay slips that were 5 years old. So she scanned all those pay slips, put them into an app, and then gave, I think, the MyGov app, and then tried to prove that she didn't actually owe $20,000. Mm-hmm. So this debt that she supposedly accrued was apparently during time when she was on youth allowance. And youth allowance is generally given to people between the ages of 16 and 20. And she was told that she was reporting her income incorrectly, that she was reporting her after-tax income instead of her before-tax income, reporting fortnightly instead of weekly. So, yeah, that's basically what happened. And then she contested the debt, and actually came back. So Centrelink came back and then said, actually, you now owe $30,000. The payment plan that she agreed to means that she pays something like $50 per fortnight. So she's going to be paying off this debt for like 20 years, essentially. So it's a huge thing that's hanging over her head. And she was saying that just made her feel really kind of demoralized and depressed. And I think there are other stories of people who feel similarly, like having this kind of trauma and this material debt contributes to feelings of despair, distress, worsened incidences of mental illness, all that sort of stuff. So it's a pretty upsetting time and pretty scary also.
Yeah, I think 30K hanging over anybody's head would be a pretty scary prospect.
Yeah, definitely.
You mention in the article that after this public backlash that the program was halted in May 2017 following an inquiry by the Australian Senate. So is the time of the robo-debt over, or are people still being affected?
Well, yeah, it's interesting. So when I wrote the article, there were calls to suspend the program. I've since found out that the program is still... so the Senate had recommended that the program be suspended pending further investigation. But the coalition actually didn't end up stopping the program at all. It eventually rejected those findings in the Senate report. So it's actually business as usual. I mean, they did stop using private debt collectors, I think. But what the government has done is make tweaks to try and reduce bad publicity around the robo-debt scandal. So one journalist I've been talking to was saying that the government didn't send out any debt notices over Christmas last year. They wanted to keep the optics good or whatever. So absolutely people are still affected and are still reckoning with the fallout from the scandal. I think if you go on Twitter, people are still talking about getting contacted by Centrelink. So yeah, absolutely, it's still ongoing, and I think it'll have a really kind of traumatic effect for some time.
Yeah, so it's business as usual with a little Christmas break to kind of improve the the PR
Essentially, yeah.
of the system.
Essentially,
Okay.
yeah.
So let's get to the base of what's going on here. Could you tell me why the introduction of automation led to this drastic rise in debt notices?
Sure. I mean, so a lot of critics have pointed out, I'm certainly not the first, the flaws in the way the algorithm works. So if we can go over it just briefly again. So the algorithm calculates an average of an individual's annual income reported to the ATO by their employer over 26 fortnightly periods. And then it compares it with the fortnightly earnings reported to Centrelink by the recipient of benefits. But this has some problems. So if you're a casual or contract worker, you're always going to receive, or you would regularly receive, wages that fluctuate. So there's often going to be variations between those two earnings figures. And there's also no way for the algorithm to correct for basic errors. For example, if you or your employer makes a mistake in terms of what they record as their legal name instead of a various business name, the algorithm treats a business name and a legal name as a separate entity and therefore a separate source of income. The algorithm can't distinguish if conflicting reports are caused by spelling errors or typos. The reliance on automation is the issue here.
Sure.
So because the coalition chose to go down the path of full automation, they're missing that crucial human oversight that would be able to kind of prevent a lot of these problems from cropping up and would also prevent a lot of these kind of false debt notices being generated.
With this increase in the false debt notices, have people been able to successfully challenge them and the accusations of cheating the system that go along with that?
Yeah, that's interesting. I haven't seen any figures on how many people have been able to successfully challenge. I have read stories of people having their notices rescinded after review. I think there was some cases where I think The Guardian had reported one, an elderly man, so someone on the age pension, was saddled with a bill in the tens of thousands of dollars, and then it was eventually just recalled entirely, so he didn't have to pay it. But I think for a lot of people, and like my friend that I mentioned earlier, they felt like they were under immense pressure to submit, but they didn't have any legal recourse. Also, when you think about challenging these debt notices, it takes a lot of time out of your schedule. Lots of people have been tweeting this, trying to ring up Centrelink and being on hold for 2 hours, or just being subjected to that kind of constant, you're always on hold waiting to speak to someone, or you get hung up on, or you can't reach a human. They can't explain their circumstances. So that's been I think that has created big obstacles for people in that situation. I mean, the important thing to note here is that the burden should not be on the welfare recipient to challenge the debt, right? So people on welfare should not be held principally responsible for rectifying their own economic marginalization. It's kind of, it should be the other way around. Why is it that someone has been accused of having false debt then has to do all the work to prove that they are in fact genuinely in need of this? So it's a very kind of upsetting, and it's rigged against people on welfare essentially. So I think it makes challenging the debt notices a really daunting task.
Yeah. You've already covered the underlying problems with the algorithm that lies behind the robo-debt scandal. Would you attribute this to mistakes made in its design or the instructions given to those who designed it?
That's a really interesting question, I think. What I found to be really pertinent in thinking about this was that the algorithm has been around for a long time. It was introduced in 2011 and is used by the previous Labor government without any fanfare or drama. Are there flaws in the algorithm's design? Absolutely. But I think that there's a bigger concern in terms of its implementation. In other words, how the algorithm has been used as a tool to achieve political ends. And let me be clear about that. This is completely politically motivated. In the essay, I think I quoted the Human Services Minister, Alan Tudge. So this was, he was presiding over this scandal, basically. And so he said something like, and I quote, something like, "We must face the reality that in our desire to be a generous and caring society, we may have reached a point where we have taken our good intentions too far." So I think that tells us a lot about how the coalition government views welfare programs as well as the people on them. It's quite dehumanizing. Mm-hmm. So that to me says a lot about the ideological motives that drove that are behind the implementation of this algorithm. And that motive appears to be consistent with a desire to shred the social contract and to unravel the welfare state altogether. So the algorithm is just a tool to achieve that end, I would argue. I did see this really stunning figure on Twitter the other day, actually. So I think the government had initially said, and I wrote in my essay too, that they estimated that 1.4 billion could be clawed back in fraudulent debts with this online compliance intervention system that they had implemented. But so far, they've actually only recovered $84 million in 18 months. So it's kind of like, this is the thing. It's like, this is a really cynical, needlessly cruel policy that's inflicted so much hurt on people. But it's also an utter failure for the government in terms of like raising revenue. Like it's just failed on all fronts.
Is there a reason why that revenue goal hasn't been reached?
I guess the public outcry and I guess the calls to suspend might have had some impact. I mean, they did stop the private debt collectors from retrieving debts from welfare recipients, so that must have put a dent in that goal. Also, they were those private companies were being paid a lot of money. They had won the tender for these contracts. It just hasn't worked for them at all. I think maybe now, I think especially with like initiatives like notmydebt.com.au, people are like recording their stories online, and there's a lot more awareness about this and about the fact that there is a decent chance that the alleged debt that you have could be false. Maybe there are more people who are trying to challenge that. I also suspect it probably has something to do with the fact that Centrelink has really low morale also. And they aren't processing stuff as quickly as the government might have intended. But yeah, it's a tough question. I'm not quite sure of the answer.
So in your piece, you wrote, Australia is somewhat unique in that the vast majority of its benefits are means tested. And this explains why it's possible for a person on welfare to be indebted to the Australian government, because if someone provides inaccurate information to Centrelink, they may receive more money than what their actual situation entitles them to under a means-tested system. Why do we means test benefits, and how does it affect the way we think about welfare in Australia?
Great question. I think it's obviously there's a practical argument, and I'm sure other people can make an economic argument for means testing. Essentially, it's an argument of efficiency, this idea that it allows the government to spend money on welfare and target that money to people who need it the most. And Australia's unique, as I mentioned, because a lot of its benefits are means tested, but a lot of other countries use the similar methods to determine who should receive benefits and how much they should receive. I guess what I wanted to critique in the essay was the kind of climate that means testing maybe inadvertently creates. So basically, when you think about how it makes it increasingly palatable for cuts to be made to welfare programs that help the most vulnerable. And it also, it's a social policy that is not just about like efficiency and financial management. It's also about a certain kind of discipline, like you receive this much because you earn a certain amount of money. And if you fall afoul of that requirement, then you no longer receive this payment. It also complicates access to benefits programs too, because I think a lot of the means testing requirements can be quite complex. So often you won't even know, a lot of individuals don't even know if they qualify for benefits. And that kind of can discourage people from opting into that process. What I was, the thing that was kind of lurked in the back of my mind was like, what does it mean to have a progressive welfare policy in Australia or around the world? And I think what I wanted to get at was to kind of focus on alternatives to this system. What if welfare was universal, unconditional, rooted in a model of social citizenship that was protected by the state? What would that look like? How would that better serve our citizens? That sort of thing. And I think means testing kind of goes against that, in that it kind of separates it's separate. It's kind of socially stratifying in a sense. There are people who think that, I think I mentioned dole bludgers, and that sort of that very common trope in the Australian media, like to kind of pour scorn on people who are like seen to be loafing around and all that sort of thing. I think means testing does create inadvertently, or perhaps maybe deliberately, a climate where it's okay for people to be like, well, they don't deserve this. They don't do anything. I think in some ways means testing is quite divisive. It does divide people into kind of haves and have-nots. If you have unconditional benefits, so Medicare is a good example, then that's much harder to cut, and it's much like we all receive healthcare. That's the argument I like to make. Like, what if we had something similar for other social services programs? But that was basically kind of my critique of means testing in that essay.
Well, I think the piece does an excellent job of looking at an issue, providing context for that issue that made headlines for a certain amount of time, but is obviously still affecting Australians with real consequences for people.
Mm-hmm.
So I recommend that everybody does read it because it touches on things we haven't spoken about today and goes into a little bit more detail. I'll link to that in the show notes. As for the interview, I think that's a pretty good place to finish up. So thank you very much for your time today, Gillian.
Cool, thank you for having me.
That was Gillian Terzis speaking about her piece for Logic magazine, Austerity is an Algorithm. You may have heard Gillian mention in there, Not My Debt, which is a great resource for sharing your personal robo-debt experiences and also getting information about how you can manage it in case you're struggling. Okay, let's finish off with some music from Total Control. Here's the beginning of Luxury Vacuum, taken from their album Laughing at the System, which I found to be gratifyingly confusing, but more importantly, a good listen. See ya.